Thank you. I'm the past, Eric is the future. In this talk, I'm going to be looking at things that led up to the whole idea of ELSI in 1990 in the United States. This will be a very personal view, of course, and I'm very happy that we'll have a discussion period because I'm sure people will have questions or corrections to what I have to say. Let me begin by saying that last week on the BBC World Service television, I was watching a program on the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution in 1917. And one of the speakers one of the people interviewed was a Russian gentleman who was 100 years old. He had been born in the year of the revolution in Russia. He was still a dedicated communist, despite all that has happened in Russia and all that Russia is today. It was a very, very interesting interview. Now, let me just stress that I am not 100 years old. I have a couple of decades to go for that. But I do seem to have got to the age now when people ask me to look at the past. And I've written an article in the Journal of Medical Ethics, which was celebrating a number of years. I was the founding editor of that journal, and that was looking at the formative years. And I've written another paper, a retrospective on bioethics the last 40 years. So I guess this is my job now, is to look back and to try to make sense of the past. So that's why I've called my lecture ELSI the prequel, with a tribute towards a wonderful set of movies, of course. So what do we make of it? What do we make of where we are today? How did we get to where we are today? Let me begin by just explaining, and Eric may well refer to this already, about the very phrase ELSI ethical, legal and social issues or implications of research. This term, as far as I understand, really does begin with the Human Genome Project in the United States, which was established in 1990 with the amazing 5% of what turned out to be a very large budget devoted to ELSI. It is, as far as I know, the first example of major governmental funding, in this case, mostly the National Institutes of Health in the States, for bioethics. But the seeds of ELSI were born decades earlier. And so what I'm going to be doing is looking back to how we got to 1990. So in order to look at this, as I say, I have to be very selective. But let me begin then with the pioneers, and the most obvious place to begin is with the Hastings Center in New York, established in 1969. And here's the feature that I want to emphasize. This was started by two people, Dan Callahan and Will Galen, one a philosopher, the other a physician, a psychiatrist. So it started right at the beginning with a partnership between philosophy and medicine. And this will be the main stress of my lecture, is the idea of interdisciplinarity as absolutely fundamental to bioethics. Now, my dear friend Al Johnson wrote a book called The Birth of Bioethics, and I was asked to review this for a European journal. I'm afraid I really like Al a lot, but I'm afraid I was not terribly complimentary about this book. And the title of my talk was, my review was, My Country, 'Tis of Thee. The Insularity of American Bioethics. Because it's a wonderful account from Al of the developments in the United States. And there is one chapter which mentions the rest of the world. So, I'm sorry, but that's not actually what happened. Okay. So things did begin very clearly with the Hastings Center. And of course, with the publication of the Hastings Center report in 1971. And this journal goes to the present day and is obviously one of the most important journals in our field. But things were happening elsewhere as well, and I'll just take the example of Britain, although there were other places in Europe where developments were important also. So what happened in Europe was the founding of a society called the Society for the Study of Medical Ethics, which was founded in the early 1970s. And the interesting thing about the development of the society, of SSME, which is now called the Institute of Medical Ethics, but it's the same organization, is that this began from the dissatisfaction in medical schools with the lack of ethics teaching and discussion. So a whole movement called the Medical Group movement, started with the London Medical Group, was devoted to trying to change the whole ethos of the medical curriculum and to make sure that ethics was part of medical training. So the SSME then, as you can see, was roughly about the same time as the Hastings Center. And not long after that, in 1975, the Journal of Medical Ethics was launched. And the interesting thing here, again, you see my theme. This was a joint publication of the British Medical Journal and the Society for the Study of Medical Ethics. I'm keeping an eye on my watch because I have a lot of stories, but some of them I can tell you at coffee. But let me tell you this story about how I became the first editor of the Journal of Medical Ethics in 1975. And that is that I had actually published a book called Moral Dilemmas in Medicine, which was originally a textbook for nurses. And the publisher said, no, you better aim it at doctors as well. So I added doctors as well. So they advertised for an editor of the Journal of Medical Ethics. And they had, in the advertisement, a medical practitioner with ethical awareness or something of that kind. And he couldn't find any doctors who knew anything about medical ethics. And then one of the very senior medics on the panel that was appointing editor said, well, I've just read this book by this chap, Campbell. He said, unfortunately he's not a doctor, but he sounds like a doctor. And so, to everyone's surprise, the first editor of the JME was a philosopher and theologian, not a medical doctor. But here again, I want to come back to the philosophy of the Journal of Medical Ethics. From the very start, and maybe it was even more important because of the fact that I was not medically qualified, from the very start, we emphasized, although it was called medical ethics, not bioethics, which was not really a term used in Britain in the 1970s, it was essential that this was an interdisciplinary journal. So the board, you can look back in the archives if you like, and you'll see that I had two very senior medical figures as consulting editors, and we had an editorial board that was across the range of the disciplines. both the professional disciplines, nursing and social work and so on, and the academic disciplines of law, philosophy, theology, and of course, lots of areas of medicine, medical sociology as well. So things were really happening in parallel between the US and the UK at that time. Things were developing in the same direction. At the same time, I think bioethics or medical ethics in the 70s looked a little bit like a kind of sport, a kind of thing that you could do if you felt like it. And a dear friend of mine, Roger Higgs, who was the case conference editor and himself also a medic, he loved to tell this story of the senior consultant that were in this ward round, and somebody said, well, maybe there's something to do with ethics here, you know, there was a patient who was dying or something. And this very senior doctor said, when somebody talks about ethics, I reach for my golf clubs. I reach for my golf clubs. His name wasn't Trump, but it might well have been. Okay, so the idea that somehow it was an additional thing, nice for those that thought it mattered, but so that was there was a long way to go for the whole discipline to be perceived both by the professions, and especially the medical profession, because it's the most tribal of all the professions, but also by governments, to be seen as something that really mattered. So what was the next thing that resulted in change? Well, here again, we really need to go back to what happened next in the history. But I've suggested there are two key drivers to what happened next. And the first is the whole idea that no one discipline can actually cope with the issues that were coming up. That it wasn't right for it to be only a medical preserve, but nor did the philosophers have the answers. Nor the lawyers, although there's a tendency often to think the lawyers do, but they're the first to say they don't. So interdisciplinarity became terribly important, increasingly so, as the next things happened, which is as things became more complicated. So now we have to look at the revelations of unethical research, Henry K. Beecher in the USA, M.W. Papworth in the UK. Papworth less well known, but his book, Human Guinea Pigs, published around that time, was also as influential as Beecher's in the States, in revealing that the idea that somehow this has all been sorted out at Nuremberg, and of course that doctors don't misbehave in research, or medical scientists or anyone else, was actually completely misplaced. And it's very interesting, I often say, how many decades, how many years did it take to get from the revelations of the war and the Helsinki Declaration, nearly 2 decades, before we began to say we actually have to do something about this. The other thing is, of course, and these are just 2 examples of the way in which new things were emerging that were setting up new issues. New birth technology and organ transplantation, with the first heart transplant particularly, throwing up new issues about the nature of death, about the nature of life and of human life, and of reproduction. So things were moving beyond the sense of safety of keeping ethics within a professional domain. And so both the Hastings Center Review, as I've said already, and the Journal of Medical Ethics had an interdisciplinary philosophy that no one discipline could adequately deal with these issues. But we're still not talking about dollars and cents. We're talking about worries and concerns. So how does this shift to people actually putting their money where their mouth is, as to use a not very nice English expression? I don't know what it would be in Japanese, but pay up, pay up if you think it's important. Don't just say it's important. Put your money where your mouth is. Well, governments begin to take notice. And here, of course, here is where the Belmont Report is so important. And it's very, very interesting. I would recommend all of you to go back and look at the Belmont Report. It is just a fascinating document. You'll also recognize many names there of people who are still active in the field. Tom Beecham being one of them, for example, Beecham and Childress. And of course, Al Johnson and many, many others. This was a government commission established in the USA and established in 1974 with the report published in 1978. And here is government, the beginnings of government funding for making things change, for making things happen. So the US led the world in the whole area of oversight of human research, human biomedical research and experimentation, waking up from the illusion of safety that was around for the decades after the Nuremberg trials. So that's a terribly important feature. In Britain, the interesting one is the Warnock Report. And Don Chalmers referred to this yesterday, where because we had the first test tube baby in Britain, so-called, that's what the press like to call it, the government thought maybe we'd better do something about this and decide whether we need any laws or not. And so they set up and funded a government commission under the philosopher Mary Warnock, and Mary Warnock produced this report. There's an interesting history we can discuss later about the controversies in the committee itself. But the final report recommended the setting up of a government authority that would be properly funded, and that this authority would oversee the whole field of new birth technology. And in this sense, it turned out that, again, I happen to be comparing Britain and the States, Britain was well ahead of the States, because this was every example of new birth technology in private clinics or public clinics, totally overseen by a government-funded authority, and with legislation, clear legislation to govern it. So we're beginning to see that governments are sitting up and taking notice. Then we have the whole question of brain death, and the Harvard criteria is a very important first step leading to an act in the United States about the definition of death, with similar documents coming from other professional bodies in the UK and elsewhere. And again, of course, all this provoked by organ transplantation and the whole question of the heartbeat cadaver, or whatever you want to call the donor who is technically dead, but only from the point of view of brain dead, not in other ways. So again, you can see the way in which bioethics is now actually beginning to influence government legislation and government policy. So again, yesterday, I apologize for those of you who were not here yesterday, but my friend Don Chalmers said that he was a constitutional optimist. Well, I'm a professional pessimist. And so things have gone downhill. Right? Things have gone downhill, and I think we have to be working to try to get back to the sense that actually the ethical dimensions of new developments in medicine and science are absolutely critical. They're not, if you feel like it, they're not an afterthought. They're central, and they must be funded as part of any funding in the future. We need, and this is what happened with ELSI, but it's very erratic now. We need something that has both political will and philosophical grounding. You can't have one without the other. We need them both. Secondly, ideally, governments are there to promote public good. Here again, you can tell I said ideally. I'm a professional pessimist. But to the extent that they do promote public good, they have to perceive that part of public good is the proper control, governance, regulation of all the new things that are coming to us. And thirdly, this grounding depends on the concept of public reason, and here I quote the Constitution of the International Association of Bioethics, which speaks about free and reasoned discussion of the issues in bioethics. That's what must be promoted. But I'm a little bit I'm a little bit pessimistic because it looks like we're going back to very erratic funding instead of consistent notion of funding. That's my last point, is a rather negative point. It's become more of a feature internationally, so I apologize for speaking only about Britain and the USA. It's a longer talk. I would have liked to talk much more widely. But what we have here is erratic funding. The other thing that worries me is people are retreating again into their professional or disciplinary silos. There's far more stress now on working alone and making an impact in your field than there is on working together across disciplines to make an impact on our society. When I read philosophy back in Edinburgh in the 1950s, we were not allowed to discuss practical issues. Not allowed. If we did, we were marked down. I failed to get the prize in first year philosophy because I dared to suggest that there were some practical implications in Plato's philosophy. Philosophers just do philosophy. They don't deal with practical issues. That's the kind of attitude that will never allow this to flourish. So, I apologize if I've run slightly over time, but I am stopping now. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Alastair described himself as the past and me as the future. That's not quite right anymore. If he's the ancient past, I'm the more recent past. The future is actually sitting in the back of the room. Shaniqua Collier, my former postdoc, the 4 people listed on pages 10 and 11 of your brochure, that's the future. It's our early career researchers in this field. The rest of us are representing various chapters of the past. What I want to do today is to take the story from 1990 that Alastair gave us the foundations of and sketch what's happened since, mostly in the U.S., almost entirely, I admit, in the U.S. from my point of view. It's very much a view from 30,000 feet in the air from my airplane window as I was crossing the Pacific yesterday while you were having your fabulous first session. Apologize for missing that. But I came to the NIH in 1990 as a junior early career researcher myself. I just started my work with a PhD in philosophy, working in medical schools and bioethics, and the Human Genome Project was launched at the NIH. It had been prepared, it had been planned, it had been conceived of during the 80s when people in medical genetics and human genetics began to notice that we were creating maps of the human chromosomes, locating new gene discoveries across the genome in specific locations. And it occurred to scientists that maybe we should do this once and for all in a wholesale way, create a complete map of the human genome, and then why not sequence the whole thing as well. So 2 reports in the late 80s. 1987, the National Academy of Sciences produced its feasibility study for this Human Genome Project, and followed up by a congressional report and a series of congressional hearings. Notice that's exactly 30 years ago today, this year. Both of them assessed the science, and then both of them had a final last chapter, kind of a throwaway at the end, a rhetorical flourish that said, oh yes, and there will probably be some social implications to this work. Somebody should pay attention to that. It wasn't clear whose responsibility it was to pay attention to that, but bioethics, as Alastair had described, had gained a foothold, and so the scientific community and the medical community were aware that there were people who liked to pay attention to this sort of thing. And so it made sense to nod in its direction. Then in 1989, at a press conference announcing the launch of the Human Genome Project at NIH, Dr. Watson, James Watson, of the double helix fame, was the first director of the project, and he was asked by a reporter, "Are you concerned, Dr. Watson, about any ethical or social implications?" The sort of thing that came up in those last pages of the reports. And he said, in his very impromptu, spontaneous way, "Yes, of course. In fact, we are going to put aside 5% of our budget to try to sponsor research on those issues." NIH had no idea. But he was the director, so they stood behind that and had to develop a plan for how to put NIH research money into something like this. So they did what NIH does, which was to turn to the extramural community, the community of academics out in the world who get their grant support to do research from NIH, and put together a menu, a solicitation for research projects that would cover what they thought was the waterfront of issues spinning out of genomic research. And at the time, it was pretty much, there were 9 items. It covered most of the issues you could think of that had been noticed before in the context of medical genetics and genetic research. That's when I entered the scene. I came to be the program officer, the bureaucrat in charge of managing the grant submissions and review and funding. And so over the next decade and a half, those grants were made. And I'll rush over a lot of history. By 2005, 200 million American dollars had been spent through that program on interdisciplinary research projects, the interdisciplinary training of early career researchers, fellows and graduate students, and education at various levels. True to Alastair's commitments and the framework of the early field of bioethics, the emphasis was on the interdisciplinarity of the enterprise from the beginning. It was ethical, legal, and social implications all mixed together And beyond that, just as importantly, the science. Working, ethicists, lawyers, and social scientists working together with the genome scientists who were pursuing the research. One important milestone in this program, which continues today and continues to spend its 5%, or at least try to, has been the establishment in 2005 of a way to institutionalize the enterprise in American academic settings, which was to fund a series of centers that would not only be a house for the research at universities, but would very explicitly have training programs for early career researchers. So there are 10 of those now scattered around the U.S. And since then, I guess the other recent development I would want to bring your attention to about just the mechanics of the program is that the most recent wave of energy has been to actually fold the ELSI research into larger genomic science initiatives. So when the genome scientists became ready to do clinical assessments of genome sequencing for diagnostic purposes, see what impact it would have on patients and clinicians in the healthcare system, the ELSI community was tapped to apply for pieces of those large clinical sequencing grants. This has become known in the U.S. as doing embedded ELSI, embedded in the science. And as you can imagine, creates plenty of discussions about the tensions of doing that kind of interdisciplinary work. Are we embedded or are we in bed with the scientific community in doing this? And by that I mean, have we simply adopted the agenda of the genome scientists and turned into servants of the genome science to help it do its job better, rather than playing the role that ELSI scholars have clung to of being social critics of the implications of the science. Finally, of course, in 2011 to the present, I think we have to notice the attention shifting from the many national silos in the ELSI field to international collaborations through organizations like the ELSI 2.0 Collaboratory. And just to bring that thread to the right up to the current state, I'm sure the next landmark in the field will be the 2017 International Kyoto Summit. So when I give this, the program, so now I want to talk about the priorities that the program has focused on over the years. It had a very vague and open-ended mission to begin with, simply to develop programs addressed at understanding the implications of the Human Genome Project, to identify and define the major issues and develop initial policy options to address them. Doesn't necessarily say it has to be interdisciplinary, but that was the commitment of the field. And it does say that it's supposed to have some kind of practical application, a practical impact, even if those are just initial policy options, which then the real policymakers would have to take forward. And the approach was interesting and a source of some debate in the early years, because traditionally, in America, when we wanted to pay national attention to a set of issues, like how do we do research with human subjects, we would form an expert commission, like the commission that supported the Belmont Report, and bring together scholars and physicians and scientists, and maybe a patient advocate or two, to sit down and give us their wisdom. This is a very different case. I used to call it the uncommission, the anti-commission, because the philosophy was we will open up the agenda and invite the community of academics in these different fields to tell us what the issues are and to apply for what they see as the most pressing research questions. The effort was to develop an evidence base, empirical evidence, but also good philosophical arguments for the professional and public policy making that would have to come. And in this way, by organizing a field, creating a field in some ways of academic research, establishing it in a more permanent way than a simple commission or a big policy project would be able to do. Create a social immune system in the society for being able to respond to new developments when they came along, even if they weren't on that initial 9-point menu. So as a result, if you need to point to practical outcomes for this kind of research, which of course we all are under pressure to do, the ELSI program has a nice CV, a nice resume of things that it can point to as having arguably some influence. We do have anti-genetic discrimination legislation in the U.S. at the state and now at federal levels. The social scientists who study the media tell us that the presentation of genetic findings is more sophisticated than it was in the 1990s. It's no longer simply the crystal ball of genetic determinism suggesting that each new gene test will tell you your fortune. These days, the journalists are much more nuanced in their presentation, as are scientists themselves. We've begun to work on best practices for the clinical setting in both genetic testing and now, more recently, the use of sequencing technologies in the clinical setting. And one surprise development, I think, for many in the genome community was that in the course of this couple of decades, the practice of human genetic research has been transformed when it comes to thinking about the requirements for informed consent from DNA donors, where we get our DNA and what limits are put on our ability to do subsequent research with it. It's very different than it was in the 1990s. There are new generations of cross-trained scholars, like Dr. Collier. And across the American science funding establishment, it's not an unusual thing now to see ELSI-like social impact assessments built into other big science initiatives. So when the National Science Foundation launched its initiative on nanotechnology, they funded as part of that ELSI of nanotechnology research and centers around the country. And of course, internationally, the scramble to join in on the Human Genome Project in the 90s immediately resulted in many countries around the world adopting this American model of saying, yes, we should put aside some resources for thinking about the ethical and social implications. They didn't want to call it the American brand, right, of ELSI, so everybody came up with their own acronym for their programs, all combinations of genetics, ethics, law, and society. But the business boomed internationally, and while many of those funding streams in other countries have shifted over time, gone away, been diverted to other purposes, the community still exists. So what were the issues that were at the top of people's minds? I've done a kind of philosopher's history here, which means that no historian would tolerate it, by imposing 5-year brackets around different sets of priorities. In the beginning, the critics of the ELSI program were quick to point out, look at the things you're interested in: genetic privacy, genetic discrimination, the clinical integration of genetic tests. Those are things that won't happen until the Genome Project is finished. you're not even talking about the ethics of the genome research itself. You're looking way downstream at its eventual impact on society. And that's true. In the beginning, it was downstream, futuristic, anticipatory focus on what the Genome Project might do if its promises came true. In the process, however, once you've got scholars from our fields involved with the science, inevitably the attention began to shift upstream to how the science was being done itself. And the first round of that was in thinking about the need for large samples, large amounts of genomic data in order to study human genetic variation, which would be crucial to the promise of pharmacogenomics. And the need for biobanks as a key tool in doing that research, repositories for these large amounts of data. This then in the late 90s began the whole discussion of biobanking and the issues of consent that come along with that. What does it mean to donate a sample for storage and reuse? What does it mean to attempt to de-identify DNA samples and to protect confidentiality? Many of you are familiar with that literature, even leaders in it. But this was a kind of midstream research issue because now we were doing this with human samples. We'd finished the map or sequencing and mapping many people. And at the same time, then in the next 5 years, another set of midstream translational issues were those that came up when we started using these tools out in the world. And two particular sets of issues became prominent in the early 2000s. One was the fact that physicians weren't the only ones using the tools, but commercial companies found a market for the tools in offering genetic testing directly to the public in a consumer model. So questions of commercialization, how do we want to translate this research to the public? Should we use the market to do it? And then questions about how we return all this information we are gathering to the patients themselves. The return of results discussions. All right, moving right along then, up until 2010, my sense is the discussion is focusing even further upstream. Not just from the challenges of trying to do genomic research, but the challenges of trying to plan genomic research initiatives from the start. And how we work out the scientific community's commitments to data sharing, for example, when we're working across communities that have very different views about their interests in particular samples and data. That's, I think, almost where we are. Now I have a question mark after 2015 because the thing that's changed has been the arrival of the potential for interventions in the human genome through the human gene editing technologies. There may be an ELSI grant from the NIH on those topics by now, but there's not a lot of activity yet in our community on those topics, but it's obviously coming. So just now to lump those 5-year brackets together into 3 packages, the downstream issues. In this era, early era, the sense was that the Genome Project was going to spin off a new genetic test every now and then, and it would land in the calm pond of our lives and create these ripples. And so we should be prepared for the ripples. What kinds of family issues would come up for people who got their genes tested? What sort of professional issues might come up for their clinicians? And public issues for societies trying to prevent the information from being used against them. Along with this came the sense that this this stream, these drops into the pond of life, would be a pretty exceptional and new kind of event for us to deal with. So special concepts and rubrics were needed. We needed not just to think about medical privacy, but genetic privacy. We needed to think about rights to know and not know, as well as simple autonomy rights. And we needed to think about the special form of discrimination, genetic discrimination, on top of the other sorts of civil rights categories that we've used. This has been criticized in years since as being a form of genetic exceptionalism. That actually, if you look at them, these issues do occur in other parts of healthcare and medicine and scientific research, and there's nothing magic about the fact that they're created by genetic information. And so in the next set of issues, the midstream issues, you found less of that genetic exceptionalism and more of a return to normative frameworks that people were comfortable with in the trenches, in actually doing the research and healthcare. So I call this midstream issues navigating the rough seas of actually trying to do genomic research and apply it to the clinical setting, including these research issues around biobanking. How should we do consent and de-identification? What should we mean by the ownership of those samples? Where should benefit sharing come in? How in the world are we going to interpret the results given this tidal wave of information that's coming at us? What should we do about incidental or secondary findings? And how will we protect consumers from being exploited? I've made up a term for this to mirror genetic exceptionalism, which I've called genetic professionalism, simply because there was a return in all these debates back to earlier settled frameworks. We no longer thought we had to invent something new for genomics, but we could look at the rules for engagement with human subjects to address the research issues, and we could look to clinical medical ethics for advice about when, for example, physicians have a duty to warn patients about incidental findings. Finally, then, this last era of looking at the upstream issues. And here, to continue the metaphor, I think the challenge has been to think about who should be steering this genetic canoe, the canoe there that's in the navigating the waves of genomics. Because it turns out there are a lot of stakeholders with interests in the direction that we take genetic research and what we do with it. The debates over data and resource sharing across international collaborations or even national collaborations, our new worries about stakeholder claims and roles, what voice should communities have in addition to individuals and scientific institutions, new concerns about international equity. Finally, we get to international equity, Alastair might say. But it's certainly been a theme in the last 5 years. And then looking down the road towards the new technologies, how should we plan ahead for technologies like human gene editing in an interdependent world where these national boundaries and borders of scientific communities are no longer self-contained? Call this the era of genetic contextualism, because we're looking beyond the lab at all the other social forces that are coming to play in the direction of genomic research. Finally, because I missed yesterday and I didn't get to tell you about what I saw the challenges being, let me take advantage of the moment to throw this slide in about what's coming in the future, I think. I think there are three trends which we in this community need to keep our eyes on, and they mirror the professionalism and contextualism phases of ELSI research. The first is a shift from the rhetoric of personal empowerment, using genomics to try to inform people's decision-making and personal abilities to take responsibility for their health care, to professional empowerment. Our debates over the return of research results, the return of results in the clinical setting, have led many to retreat into a kind of medical paternalism. Our patients can't possibly understand this wave of information. It's our obligation as physicians committed to doing no harm to take the decisions out of their hands and tell them what they need to know and avoid telling them what we think they don't need to know. Is this okay? Is this the direction we want to go in? It's a complicated question. It's not obvious that it's a bad trend, but it's worth talking about because it goes in the opposite direction of the usual ideology for medical genetics, which is all about empowering individuals to make their own choices. Secondly, a shift from interest in individual and familial concerns, problems, health problems, to community interests. And we see this in the discussions of data and sample sharing plans, in the discussions of recruitment into genomic research, and in the discussions of the role of genomic research in addressing health disparities between different social groups. The collective interests of different communities, even different nations, have emerged on the scene as a powerful voice in the discussions, and we're going to have to decide at what point we think those collective interests outweigh the interests of individuals and families in this domain, up until the point of claims of national genomic sovereignty over the exportation and use of DNA resources. Finally, the shift from genomic risk assessment to genomic intervention, in the context of gene editing, that's obvious. It's on its way, and it's reopening ethical and cultural debates about the limits of those technologies. Our comfortable position of procrastination, when we said we're not ready for germline engineering or enhancement, so we just won't do those, we'll draw a line around that box, is crumbling from a number of different directions as the rationale for using technologies in ways that sort of look like enhancement. We're going to use them in cancer vaccines to prevent cancer by boosting, enhancing the body's immune system to seek out and destroy cancer cells better. That's a new kind of human we've just invented, but not necessarily wrong, it seems. So we're going to have to reconsider those lines that we've traditionally drawn. How can you keep up with all this? Well, of course, you want to join with us who have gotten excited about doing this in an international way through the ELSI 2.0 network of scholars. And I invite you to visit the website. Thanks very much.